Trudy Jacobson, one of the co-chairs of the ACRL Information Literacy Competency Standards for Higher Education Task Force. And we'd really, really like to welcome you all today. It sounds like there's lots of people here.
And I'm Craig Gibson, and I'm the other co-chair of this task force, and we're very, very glad to have you all participating. We welcome your participation going forward. We want to hear from you about what we present today.
Okay. So there is a Twitter hashtag, and it's ACRLIL Revisions if you would like to tweet. Okay. And so just to give you a sense of what it is we're planning for this hour, we will give you more information about sort of the standards revision, where it's sort of come from, where it's going, why the changes are needed, how we're looking at doing it, how we're going to be moving forward, and as Craig just mentioned, answering as many questions as we can. At the last one, they were coming fast and furious, but we got through a lot of them. And then we hope that, while many of you are actually in the room with a lot of your colleagues, you'll be able to share what you learned here today with others who weren't able to attend. We'll be interested in learning more about some of the main areas that we're going to be talking about today that are going to figure into this new model. And then sort of be aware that you're going to be able to continue to provide input into the process. And so the outline. So changing environments, both the information, educational, the recommendations of the previous task force on which I served, membership, current membership, the sort of the way we're thinking and those new elements, and then what we expect to happen over the next few months.
So just a little bit of background here. Most of you probably know that the current or the existing information literacy standards have been with us for quite a while. They were approved almost 14 years ago, and they have served us very, very well. They have really advanced the conversation in higher ed around information literacy, not just among academic librarians, but among other stakeholders and partners. They've been used by regional accrediting bodies and higher ed associations. There have been disciplinary versions of them created, and they have been translated into several languages as well. However, the previous task force, which Trudy served on, and which she will talk about in a little more detail, we feel that perhaps given what's happened in the last decade, that those standards are showing their age somewhat. We think that they don't really address as well as they might the globalized information environment, and they're not recognizing students as content creators, perhaps as well as they could. And relating to that, they're not showing the challenges that students have in just dealing with a much more complicated environment that's multi-format and media rich. And we think that the current standards probably also don't sufficiently address the need to position IL more integrally as a set of concepts and practices in all disciplines, and to go along with that, to allow for a framework that's more open-ended and dynamic, and thinking about the information environment that is very, very fluid, evolving, and changing all the time. Again, addressing student understanding of the knowledge creation process, we feel that the current standards haven't probably addressed that adequately, and also that the current standards really emphasize the cognitive aspect of learning, but also perhaps needed to address metacognitive and dispositional or affective aspects of learning all through the research process. and also to think of information literacy as we know all learning is, as cumulative and recursive and developmental over time, rather than just looking at it in small increments or bits and pieces. We also think that the current standards really didn't or don't address scholarly communication of publishing or knowledge of data sources as well as they might, or perhaps recognizing the need for data curation abilities. So as good as the current standards are, and as well as they've helped us move forward, we think that we could produce something else that would serve the library world, but also more importantly, all of higher ed in a more integral way, looking at all of the gaps and deficits that I've just gone through.
Okay. So there was a task force that worked for, I guess it was about a year, that did a very extensive review of the literature, and came up with a number of recommendations, including a unanimous decision that we did not think that they should be reapproved in their current form. We thought that they did need extensive revision and came up with a number of areas that we mentioned specifically. So one of the things that we really spoke a lot about was that we really want educators other than just librarians to sort of understand them. But because the standards as we know them are very inclusive, they're also a little bit daunting if you're not in our field. So we really wanted to address that element. We also did not want to use unduly library jargon. In the last one of these open forums, there was a massive sort of conversation going on in the chat about jargon, and we recognize that there are terms that are particular to our field and that are needed, but just keeping in mind that we really want other audiences to also sort of be engaged by these. As Craig mentioned, including affective and emotional learning outcomes, there really has been a focus on the cognitive ones, and we sort of wanted to move beyond that model. So things that would address self-efficacy, student confidence, attitudes, motivation, valuing what is being learned. And also acknowledge complementary literacies. There's so many different literacies that we hear about all the time, and it will be impossible, and it's not our goal to try to incorporate all of them. But we do want to acknowledge that that there are other sort of abilities that are needed that in the past just didn't really exist, or that did not have the focus that they do now, and therefore sort of moving beyond sort of an implicit focus on format. Then we want to address the role of the student as content creator, which with social media and the ability for everybody to be able to create content, there's certain responsibilities and such that go with that, and knowledge, and so the willingness to do it, and then content curator, as Craig has mentioned. And then the last one that we had was sort of provide continuity with the AASL standards, which were developed after the standards were.
And so what we did, Trudy and I last fall, working with ACRL, we put together, invited a number of people from the library field, but also outside the library field, to serve on our task force to help us develop or look at a new model, or to revisit the standards along the guidelines that the recommendations that the previous task force developed. So I'm showing you here the list. I won't go through all of the names. I would just say that we do have a fairly wide representation from within academic libraries, as well as we have an accreditation official from the Middle States Commission. We have an academic technologist. We have someone from a foundation in San Francisco. We have someone from, yeah, we could go to the next slide.
Okay, great.
And we have somebody from a teaching and learning center. And so we've had some very, very interesting conversations with our group in the last several months. So we met at ALA, at annual ALA in Chicago, and then we've had phone calls and online sessions as well. And so that's the group that, and I wanted you to see the membership. So what we are now looking at, kind of the overarching goal, is developing a new model that would provide a holistic framework for all of higher education. And we want to acknowledge that abilities, knowledge, and motivation surrounding information literacy are critical for everybody. And it's not just college students, of course, although that's our particular focus, but it's for everybody, regardless of where they are, whatever level of education they are just in their daily work and their professions. Information literacy is very important. We particularly wanted to focus on collaboration and the critical need for librarians and faculty members to work together even more closely to effectively address information literacy education. So to that end, we have been looking at two major elements: threshold concepts and meta-literacy. I'm going to talk about threshold concepts, and Trudy will pick up with meta-literacy. Threshold concepts, if we go to the next slide, I will go through several characteristics, but here's perhaps a definition that I think many people are aware of or have seen, or if you've just recently have gotten curious about what they are. Here's a pretty good definition. Those are the core or foundational ideas in any field or discipline that define it, but they're so tacit or implicit in many cases that the experts in the field take them for granted, and therefore novices or students who are trying to learn the subject matter in that discipline are challenged by it because they are learning bits and pieces of information in a way that doesn't allow them to integrate what they are learning. So the whole premise behind threshold concepts is that they are gateways or portals into understanding that discipline or that body of knowledge in a more complete, more integral way. So there are two researchers in the UK who've written a whole lot about this, and I would simply say that this has become quite a grassroots movement in faculty circles, both in this country, but again, it started in the UK. Meyer and Land published some of the earliest research and thinking on threshold concepts probably 10 years ago, and they enumerated 5 criteria for deciding what a threshold concept would be. So faculty in a variety of disciplines have been having these discussions and debates about what threshold concepts, say, in history are, or sociology, or biology, or an applied field like accounting, or in computer science. Basically, there are 5 of these, and the most important one, perhaps, is a threshold concept needs to be transformative. That is, once the student grasps what the threshold concept is, there's a fundamental shift in perspective. It may come about through an aha moment. Sometimes it's more of a process of struggle and help and getting help from more capable others. Also, threshold concepts are integrative. They allow students to assemble other concepts in a way that they achieve deeper understanding, and they are able to understand the way of thinking that goes on in that particular field. I keep coming back to way of thinking and acting and practicing. I think that's another way of thinking about what a threshold concept is and what it enables people who enter a field to do. Another characteristic that Meyer and Land proposed was threshold concepts are irreversible. In other words, once you've got it, you don't go back to an earlier level of understanding. They also say that they're bounded. They help kind of define what a discipline is. And this is really important. These are gaps in understanding. They're troublesome to learn. They're not easy. They're not easy to learn initially, but once they are grasped, they really enable accelerated understanding of other parts of the discipline. So those are threshold concepts, and what we're thinking of now is looking at how they could be combined with some elements from metaliteracy, which Trudy will pick up on.
Yes, so I mentioned earlier that with so many different literacies that trying to make this a manageable, workable item, we really aren't able to address all of them. And there have been a number of questions in these forums about what about health literacy or financial literacy or visual literacy. So one of the things that we are considering is metaliteracy. And so that's building upon information literacy, but it's also sort of acknowledging that sort of a different and interactive and expansive information environment where people communicate, create, share information. Technology is often a part of that. We don't really know what technologies are going to develop, but sort of thinking about the abilities and the mindset and the metacognitive aspect of it that would help people to fully participate in this environment. And there's 4 domains that are part of metaliteracy learning, which sort of go back to what Craig had been talking about before and that we considered in the previous task force that will be represented in what we're working on. The behavioral, which we're all aware of, the cognitive, the affective. We all know so many students are sort of blocked from doing things just because of their fear, their worry, or other feelings that they have. And then the metacognitive, so sort of being aware of their own thinking and what they need to know and to learn and such.
So here's where we are with our work on the task force. We have a member of our task force, Lori Townsend, who's been working with another group on a list of threshold concepts. And actually, there's an article cited at the end of this presentation by Lori and a couple of co-authors on threshold concepts and information literacy, which you can refer to later. But that group that Lori is on has been vetting a list of potential threshold concepts for information literacy. And we have been looking at that list, and what we're doing now is deciding which ones we think would help us with create a framework, in effect. And one that we, I think, have agreed on is one that we're calling scholarship as a conversation. And I think practicing instruction librarians know this intuitively. They know it from long experience that students don't often understand how individual pieces of scholarship or data or information fit into anything larger, and they don't understand the context to it, for it. And so what we want to do is say that this is a threshold concept for information literacy. We have an explanation here, a brief synopsis of what we mean by it. This may not be the final version. I would simply say this is a draft. This is a placeholder in a way, but this is to convey the idea of what we mean by scholarship is a conversation. Then, to go along with that, we are proposing, again, this is a draft, that we would address that affective dispositional domain that would go along with the threshold concept itself. And so what I've given here are a couple of those. You can see those. And then to go along with those, there would be another category that I would call knowledge practices. These might look like what we have thought of as learning outcomes. In the existing standards, there are, of course, learning outcomes there that people have used or rewritten or adapted for their local institutions. So we're giving 3 examples there of what I would call knowledge practices. So in other words, if I had this all laid out in a matrix here, we would have, if we could go back to the previous slide, we would have scholarship as a conversation as the core element. It's the threshold concept. And then the next slide again, we would have the dispositions that go with it, and then the knowledge practices that go with it as well. And so what Trudy is talking about with meta-literacies is to look at a meta-literacy that would also combine with the threshold concept. Trudy, would you like to add anything to that point?
Yeah, we've identified learning objectives for meta-literacy, and it's really so striking that there's a number of overlaps with the threshold concepts. So we thought we would bring in the ones that are appropriate to the threshold concepts.
So we would suggest some assignments or assessments that would go with that particular threshold concept. So again, I won't go through these in detail. I'm just giving you examples. And these would be ones that could be developed at local institutions. People will need to develop their own. I think based on what I read in the literature of threshold concepts and what faculty are doing in their own fields with assessing threshold concepts, they're using a lot of authentic assessment. They're developing thought exercises, or they're developing scenarios, or they're developing other techniques that really test the student's ability to get to the level of understanding with threshold concepts. So there's a lot of work, and very interesting work, to be done with assessment of threshold concepts. We're just at the beginning of that.
So to let you know sort of where we're planning to go, we've started these online forums, and we do have Kate, who is our visiting program officer with ACRL, and she has been working to sort of promote and to publicize and get feedback from other higher education community stakeholders. And so that is an ongoing effort that Kate Gansky has been really helpful with. This December 1st deadline may be a couple of weeks off. We have a task force meeting in just a very little while, and we'll be talking about that. But we think it will be in December, and then there will probably be more online forums or hearings, as well as one at midwinter. And due to the interest and the unfortunately small room that we had at annual, this is a room for 300. However, if you are interested, then we would really recommend you might want to come early, just like today's meeting. I think that there's going to be a lot of interest from people to hear where we are then. We'll then have a chance, once this draft is out, for comments to be submitted, and the deadline would be about February 7th. We've been reporting to the ACRL board and the ACRL executive committee. I spoke with the executive committee a little over a week ago, and they support the direction that we're going, which, as you can tell, is really rather different from the standards as they were developed the last time. Then we'll share the near final draft with 2 other ACRL groups, the Information Literacy Standards Committee and the ACRL Standards Committee, to get their input. And then next summer, the final report will go to the ACRL board so that we can, I guess then they will make a decision on this. So throughout, there really is a lot of discussion going on, giving people a chance to hear about it once the draft is out, getting feedback about it, consulting with the ACRL board, consulting with other education stakeholders. So a lot of communication. Okay, and this, as part of the recording, this will be available to you, but it's also available on the ACRL website, the references, the quotes, and there is the URL for that, and Craig's and my email. If you find that you have questions, there will be a Q&A set up on the website as it mentions here, once we can sort of finish getting that prepared. So I think, Craig, that we're ready. I know a lot of comments and questions have been coming in.
Oh yeah, there's lots and lots of questions already coming in. So I think I will probably need to read back through some of these to begin to pick up on, but I know we're opening up now for Q&A. So, and we will be going, I will note that we will be going through all of the questions and comments from this session as well as two previous ones. They will be archived, and we will be studying, perusing those so that we can be able to respond in a way that we hope we're addressing a lot of the questions that are being raised. Somebody's wanting to see the slide references one more time.
Yep, got it. I think it's up. Can you see it? Okay, good. So now, great.
So I'm trying to peruse, see if I can get some specific questions to respond to. Yeah, somebody's asking that we're proposing a new framework, and yes, we are proposing a new framework. I believe this is Lisa, and the elements that we just put out on those 2 or 3 slides are basically a very basic skeletal framework of what we're proposing to include. I think the knowledge practices slide, if we could go back to that. The one with dispositions and knowledge practices. This is where I think some people are asking about skills, and I think we're giving examples of some of these. I think what we're not doing is creating a definitive list, but rather you would need to look at the examples here and then add to the list, or just as the current standards that we've been using are also a framework. I think what we need to do is to realize that there will be a lot of local work going on at local institutions to provide parallel kinds of knowledge practices or skills. This is not a definitive document. What we're trying to produce is an open-ended framework.
And one of the things that we really would like to take advantage of, and will need everybody's sort of contributions, is the ability to have an online sandbox. So as people are working with these, they would be able to say, you know, what's working for them, how they're doing it with a particular population. We know that there are so many different situations, people who are doing the one-shot sessions, people who have credit-bearing courses, people who are doing more intensive collaboration with faculty members, that there's so many different situations that some of it really is going to depend on where you are, you know, what you're able to do. And so while we're providing this framework, we really would like to see some more supporting materials that people are trying out, and what works and what doesn't work. Okay.
Their questions are being asked about the timeline, and we're aware of the timeline, and we do have some flexibility with it. We're trying to gather as much feedback as we can as we go along, and to provide the opportunities for feedback and discussion. So that we're readily acknowledging the timeline that we're working with, and we need to get as much feedback as possible through the forums like this or the one at Midwinter as well.
Bill asked, this is really a revision of the standards or a new approach, and it really is. It's a new approach. The group that did the last one selected, I think because of the time they did it in and the emphasis at that point on standards, they used that. But we're really sort of looking at a different way of thinking about it. And Ethan Pullman just asked how these standards fit with the Middle States accreditation requirement. Craig and I had a rather lengthy phone call with Ellie Fogarty of Middle States, and she's going to be doing some outreach to the other accrediting agencies, but she said that she thought that this approach is a really good way to go. She was very positive about it, and said that Middle States doesn't really dictate, how other organizations should do it. So she was not concerned in this conversation, and she is part of the task force. So. I see Lindsay's asking, are we seeking a new definition of information literacy? We've talked about not being able to really tackle that. Craig, do you want to add to that?
I think that, all right, I'm looking through, I've been looking through multiple comments here while you're talking.
Actually, I see one, sorry, I think I just lost it again, but about the faculty and whether they can then define how it fits within their discipline. I'm sorry, I've lost it, so I don't have the name of the person who asked it.
We're actually not seeking a new definition of information literacy per se. I don't think we will be able to create a definition that would satisfy all the constituencies that are interested in the topic. We will, I think as part of our document, we'll provide a provisional definition, but we won't be writing one that we think would satisfy every single constituent.
And I have to say, with the threshold concepts, that I have been talking to a number of faculty members at the University of Albany. We're undergoing a major shift in how information literacy fits in with the curriculum, moving from a separate course that's and different departments have offered that, including the libraries, to it being a competency that has to be fulfilled within the major. And so I've been doing a lot of outreach to faculty members, and this idea of threshold concepts really is grabbing their attention. Many of them know about it from their own fields, but I think that it really, it has to fit with what they're doing in their disciplines, as long as there's still some rigor to it, because otherwise the collaboration that's so essential is not going to be as easy to accomplish.
I see that Parker is asking how many threshold concepts we plan to create. The group that's been looking at using the Delphi process has 9 currently. I don't think we'll be going much higher than that. We probably will not have more than 9 or 10.
Yeah, and we've noticed, that there's some gaps, information ethics being one. We want to really think about that data curation that came from the previous task force, or information curation. STS is Science and Technology section. Yeah.
Yes.
And I've seen questions about the transition, and we've had some conversation today with Kara about not necessarily sort of removing the old standards right away, but having a transitional period, because there's a number of changes, obviously.
And then will they be called standards or something else? That has been a question we've debated quite a bit. I think what we're calling it now provisionally is a framework, perhaps a framework for information literacy competencies, but more of a framework because it conveys the idea of being open-ended and local institutions being able to adapt what we put out in terms of the framework.
Sarah Swanson and Davidson College asked about the development of the 4 domains of metaliteracy. And we worked with an instructional designer when we were working on the learning objectives, and called upon some of her expertise for that. Craig, I don't know if I missed it, if you answered this, if there's a draft list of the threshold concepts.
There is a draft list that the task force has been looking at, and what we hope to do fairly soon is to really fill out this framework based on that draft list. So yes, we are working with one.
Alicia, you're seconding Debbie Robinson's question about ideas, examples for how to transition. I think that in our discussions with the executive committee, there's going to be a real emphasis on instruction and awareness and how to use these. You know, as Craig talked about, there will be a number of ideas, both for assignments, assessment, knowledge practices, but they recognize the need that there will need to be more information, more sharing. Esther, I don't believe this goes through a vote of the membership. I believe it goes to the board.
Yeah, I believe it goes to the board.
And Patricia, the draft list, that's part of the work that we're going to be doing. It's, you know, going through the Delphi process, and I think they're in the 4th round at this point. And so we're going to be diverging a little bit because their research is continuing. There's been an enormous amount of agreement from the Delphi study members, but they're going back for some clarification, and there's a few things that we're identifying as not being represented that we want to include. Are there other questions? Rhonda, in the conversation I had with the executive board, we didn't go into this in great depth about the types of plans for professional development, but I believe webinars, there might be a pre-conference, a variety of different ways. And Anthony, how social media outlets have contributed to scholarship. Blogs by academics or experts in the field, which are a way of getting reputable information that just didn't exist as a format in the past. Oh, Lindsay, the previous task force did, as I mentioned, an extremely in-depth literature review. And then Craig, you might want to talk about, I mean, Craig's been doing an intensive amount.
I've been looking at threshold concepts, and I think there's some questions here about assessment of threshold concepts, and this is an emerging area of research, but most of what I see going on with assessment of threshold concepts developed by faculty is focused either on exercises that look like problem-based learning and are thought exercises or other kinds of more open-ended kinds of qualitative or authentic kinds of assessment. So what I'm hoping we can do in our draft here is to include some of those examples for information literacy. I think this is something that at some institutions, teaching and learning centers really would already work with faculty on, or there may be other opportunities at other kinds of institutions to work on authentic assessment. That seems to be the general direction for assessing threshold concepts and whether students are actually understanding them.
There was a question about what's the role of the librarian in this, and I think the role of the librarian is still central, but if we continue to try to do almost all of it ourselves, I don't think it's going to work. So we really do need to get others on board. You know, people have complained about the one-shot sessions for years and years, and obviously, you know, there's times when that's really all that's available, but we'd also like there to be sort of possibilities for moving beyond that. And if what comes out in this framework really does engage faculty members, that might help that situation to develop.
Yeah, I see a comment here, a threshold comes from Chris McPherson, seem to be building on the decoding the disciplines movement. Yes, that's exactly right. To be able to look at what goes on within a discipline in terms of what really are the foundational elements and understanding that discipline. And whether or not we think of information literacy as a discipline, I mean, I think we in the library community have been trying to position information literacy for a number of years as an educational reform movement with its own body of knowledge in a way. And we think that threshold concepts, if we can move this agenda forward and help it align with threshold concepts work going on with faculty, that will be doing very good work in collaboration of what Trudy's already been talking about. Readily acknowledge that one-shot sessions, which we've all taught and which we all depend on, need to be rethought, or perhaps we need to think of some ways of leveraging one-shot so that we get deeper integration around collaborative assignment design. And we think threshold concepts align much better with collaborative assignment design, deeper integration in the course, or with credit courses for those who are fortunate enough to teach them. So we are we realize we're pushing the boundaries here a little bit in terms of how we actually work with faculty or work with others across our institutions. But we think that this is more of the future for us if we focus on aligning our concepts more with faculty's disciplinary concepts.
And there's been some questions about sort of expanding the sort of definition of meta-literacy, or I'm sorry, of information literacy. And I think to some extent, yes. But I think that's also because of the world that we live in. So I don't see it becoming so massive that it's just impossible to deal with. But I really do think that, I mean, as Craig mentioned earlier, and we all know, the standards were developed a number of years ago and don't adequately reflect what we and our students and everybody else are working with now.
Yes, and I see the comment from Jim about threshold concepts sounding like some of the work done with situated cognition. This is some of the theoretical writing about how students need to learn in context and how they need to learn as apprentices, in effect, legitimate peripheral participation, communities of practice. This aligns well with other kinds of reform movements like undergraduate research programs or mentored research. We think there's potential here for information literacy to be connected in a more integral way with those kinds of pedagogies of engagement where students are working in more over extended periods with faculty or with peers on projects, project-based learning or problem-based learning. We realize this will not be the full story of what most institutions need to do with information literacy. We acknowledge there's going to be a lot of mixes of what institutions can do. We do think this framework, however, offers more potential for deeper integration.
And Pamela asked, and I think there have been others asking about describing some two-year college scenarios. And because we do, there's been a lot about here about Troy being on the task force, that we are going to be providing some examples, as we've been mentioning, but because every institution is different, it's going to need to fit into your particular scenario. And so there will be some room for creativity. We hope the sandbox that I mentioned earlier, people will start exchanging ideas about what what they find is working. So there will be some help in what we are producing, but we're hoping people will take it and run with it too. So it's a different type of entity than the standards. Standards are changing, don't always look like what they used to. And one of the things we keep coming back to is the fact that when the standards were created, I mean, now they sort of seem like they've always been there, but at that time, the ones that were created for information literacy were sort of created with nothing before them. So it wasn't as if they were following a long tradition within information literacy. Thanks, Chris. It's been fascinating work, but you're right, it's a big undertaking. So we have a few more minutes.
Yes, are there other questions? I mean, there are so many very good questions here we will be reviewing in the archived questions.
Sure. I'll go back, Matthew. Whoops. So there was a question about other threshold concepts. And again, as we've been saying, we're working with the list that's coming out of this research process. But another one that we've been doing some work on is format is a process. And that threshold concept, the wording as it stands now, and we may be working with this, but what makes a book and a newspaper article has nothing to do with how one accesses it, print/digital, but with the process that went into creating it. Understanding this principle helps students navigate the information they find online and evaluate it according to the process underlying its creation, rather than by a set of memorized, constantly changing, inconsistent characteristics. And so for that, a disposition is inclined to seek out markers for information sources that indicate underlying creation process, knowledge practices, understand that format and method of access are separate entities, recognize that different creation processes result in the presence of distinct attributes, and ability to identify which information generating processes best meet particular information needs. So that's just sort of a part of it. Other questions? Okay. Well, not seeing any new ones coming. Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, probably we'll keep the standards for a bit and maybe have a group working on the transition. Again, some of this still needs to be worked out, and I'll go back to the domains. Okay. So the recording with the slides will be available on the website, and in a minute I'll leave the learning domains and go back to the URL. And you'll continue to have the ability to provide input, and as more information is available, it will be put on the website whose URL is right here. We appreciate all of your thoughts and comments and suggestions.
Yes, thanks to everybody for your many questions, which we'll be reviewing. Somebody's asking about literature reviews, and I think we can refer you to some websites that will have some of the literature we've been looking at, and we'll also be including a bibliography in our report, our document.
Oh, and I see Grand Valley. We don't mean for this to only be within the framework of a course. We really want this to be usable in a variety of situations. What we've been talking about, Joe, is just that if there are ways of moving away from the one shot, and we know that it's not always possible, but if we engage faculty members to understand that it can't all be covered in 50 minutes, then that will be beneficial. And there might be other ways too, other than in-person instruction, to sort of accomplish some of these goals. But we really recognize that every situation, has its own unique attributes. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Allison, you can probably stop the recording.